Welcome to Strait Forward, a podcast by SCSP, where we talk all things Taiwan, the island at the forefront of technological innovation and the global fight for democracy. I'm Channing Lee.
And I'm Libby Lange. And Channing, I hear that you're actually headed to Taiwan in a few days.
Yes, I am. I'm actually flying out tonight. It's going to be a really quick trip, but a long journey. So flying from DC, you first have to have a layover in San Francisco, and then there's that whole flight over, or I guess LA. So depending on how we do it, but it's going to be a long flight and a quick trip. But I'm excited.
What are you most excited for after you get off this marathon of flights?
After the marathon of flights, well, the food, of course. The food is always really yummy. When it's a work trip, of course, there are meetings, and I'm excited to meet people and have all these really important conversations. But hopefully, I will have some time to go to one of my favorite night markets and have some chou tofu. Stinky tofu, which I love. So.
Yes, I'll leave more for you. But speaking of important conversations, what could be more important than what we're going to talk about today?
Yes, today we're discussing digital resilience, and I think it's so important when we think about Taiwan, an island that is so dependent on digital technologies for their economy, right? All of their industries, all of their various sectors rely extremely heavily on the digital space. I mean, ours does too. Any modern day economy, right, relies on digital services. And so digital resilience, that is our topic today. Do you have experience, when you were living in Taiwan, how did you think about resilience?
Yeah, I guess if I could just give maybe a more sort of personal, real life example before we dive in. So as you probably know, every year Taiwan gets hit by at least a few typhoons, right? And for those who have never experienced one, you can kind of think of a typhoon like a hurricane.
Yeah, I had a flight get canceled because of a typhoon once. So
exactly,
there you go.
Yeah. And so, once a typhoon reaches a certain level of seriousness, usually they cancel all your classes, they cancel work, even like citywide, which is actually great. But if that doesn't happen, you're kind of just expected to go about life as normal, right? And so as a college student at the time, there's a typhoon going, winds incredibly high, raining hard, but you still have to go to class, right? So you suit up, you put on your poncho, you grab your umbrella, you grab your bike, and you figure out, okay, this is going to really be difficult, but I'm still going to get to class, right? And maybe the wind blows you off of your bike a few times. I'm not going to say necessarily how many.
Libby fell off her bike many times.
Yes,
watch out.
But the important thing is that you make it there, right? You have these challenges and you find a way to sort of prepare yourself as best you can. You can never be 100% fully prepared, but you can do your best and still sort of reach that final destination.
Yeah, it's great that you bring up these natural disasters because that's, I think, challenge number one for an island that has typhoons very frequently throughout the year, during typhoon season. And so when we're thinking about digital resilience, I mean, definition-wise, we're talking about a nation's ability to maintain and quickly restore these digital services, repair digital infrastructure amid these natural disasters, amid perhaps geopolitical challenges, and any other, cyber attacks even. Right. And so we were discussing this earlier, and you pointed out that digital resilience has two aspects. There's the physical aspect of digital resilience and the cyber digital side where you can't actually see. Can you distill this down a little bit? What do you mean by physical digital resilience?
Yeah, so I think starting from kind of the closest thing to our everyday lives, what we might actually be able to physically see, you can think of the communications networks that connect us. So when I am chatting with you on the phone, it's sort of the physical infrastructure that helps that to happen. And I can tell you that people in Taiwan love their phones, right? Mm-hmm. In an island of 24 million people, there are almost 22 million internet users. There's even
90%.
Yeah, there's even a word for, how much Chinese people have their phones. Sometimes they get called 低头族, which
yes.
is like,
oh my gosh,
the people who look down, right?
My mom calls me that a lot when I'm just on my phone. Yes.
Exactly. Yes. So you understand.
Yes.
And so that kind of connectivity, day to day, we might just think of it as kind of, it's great to be able to text your friends. But in the case of a natural disaster, the government needs to be able to communicate with people, right? And people need to be able to communicate with their loved ones. And so the ability to keep those networks working and get them back up in the event that something happens to them is like critically important.
Yeah, and I think something that goes hand in hand with the communication networks is also the undersea cables. Taiwan is connected to the internet by about 15 undersea cables. You can find these on a map. Everyone knows where they are, and occasionally there is disruption. Somehow they are cut somewhere between mainland China and Taiwan, or one of the islands around Taiwan. It happened in Matsu Islands in 2023. Recently in the Baltic, so we saw other undersea cables not connecting to Taiwan, but other undersea cables somehow perhaps cut by a PLA actor, perhaps. And so, this is a story that we hear a lot. And so for Taiwan, they do think of that as a vulnerability. Right?
Yeah. And I think that's good that you kind of moved further out, kind of abstracted out into something we're probably never going to see in our lives, right? And sort of the third thing that might go on that list that we also probably, unless you go to space, won't have a chance to see are satellite communication networks. And these are something that they're really just getting more and more important as we see things like Starlink and how they're being used to provide internet in Ukraine in really challenging locations. Taiwan is really aware sort of how that could be helpful in various situations, whether a natural disaster or some kind of geopolitical tensions. And so their own space agency is actually working to launch satellites. I think the plan is to have 6 launched by 2026 to provide that kind of broadband connection to people when they need it.
A good slogan, 6 by 2026. And so moving on from the physical side, right, when we're thinking about cyber or digital, that sphere, cyber attacks, of course, cybersecurity, really large concern for Taiwan. I think Taiwan experiences about 5 million cyber attacks each day,
Wow.
which is a huge number, right? Can you imagine just 5 million cyber attacks every single day? That's all within the span of 24 hours. They are also the most targeted in terms of cyber attacks in the entire Asia-Pacific region. For Taiwan, this is actually a matter of security, of national security, right? They do experience the occasional hacking, right? They steal your passwords and data, and someone's trying to sell it for money, for ransom. But they also experience other types of cyber attacks, right?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting the way that cyber attacks can actually sort of spin out into the real world and real world effects, right? So there's a really great example from, if you remember, when former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan. And of course, leaders in China were very unhappy about that. But she still chose to go. And actually, while she was there was a hack on the 7-Eleven convenience stores in Taiwan, which, as you know,
yes,
there are so many 7-Elevens. Anywhere you look, you can probably
Staple.
see the next 7-Eleven from the 7-Eleven you're in
Yes,
in most
actually.
cities.
I've never searched 7-Eleven on Google Maps. I wonder how that would just light up my screen.
Because you don't need to. You walk downstairs and there's one there.
Exactly.
But there was actually a hack on 7-Eleven so that the displays within 7-Eleven were displaying messages like, "Go home, Nancy Pelosi," which, if you think about it, it sounds like a horror movie, right? Those messages were not meant for Nancy Pelosi herself to see. They were meant for Taiwanese people who are just doing their everyday shopping in 7-Eleven to see that and think, wow, even in the 7-Eleven downstairs from my house, these people can get to me, and just instill that sense of sort of fear and that feeling that you're not safe anywhere.
Yeah, I actually have a chilling feeling just hearing you describe it, because it reminds me of those sci-fi movies where the big grand dictator decides to put his face onto every screen in this big city, and all of a sudden all of the citizens have to look up and hear their dear leader speak. And from Taiwanese citizens' perspective, that is really daunting, right? To imagine an adversary being able to have that kind of control. So, the fact that this happened in real life. So, and it's really, really important for us to be discussing digital resilience in Taiwan, because in addition to the cyber, I think, of course, thinking about from a larger perspective, how the Chinese Communist Party is trying to meddle in their information space. Libby, you are an expert on all of this, right? What is it about Taiwan's information space that makes it so vulnerable, right? Obviously, they're online a lot. People use the web as their main source of news, as well as social media. But what about Taiwan's information space is just so important to this conversation?
Yeah, so I think part of it is that Taiwan has an incredibly free information space, right? It's consistently ranked as one of the freest in Asia. And I think that that's kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, people are very free to discuss what they want, how they want, without government intervention in those conversations. But on the flip side of that, that means that bad actors also have quite a few opportunities to sort of jump into those conversations, maybe playing the role of someone else, maybe looking like someone who is local to that conversation, but really trying to influence it from the outside. And so researchers do consistently rank Taiwan as the most targeted country in the world when it comes to disinformation attacks. And I can tell you, having lived there, you do kind of operate under this sense of a lot of what I'm seeing online, a lot of sort of anonymous comments and things like that, probably not all of them are from people who are actually like me living in Taiwan, but are probably coming from other places and really trying to bring the conversation in a different direction. Or as they would say in Taiwan, 带风向, right? You change the direction of the wind.
Yeah, and I think it's really funny because I think a lot of Taiwanese citizens are quite aware of this, because if you're living your good life in this open democracy and you're seeing all these videos on various social media sites, perhaps TikTok, which I personally don't use, but I've heard anecdotes, right? And you're watching these videos about how terrible it is to live in Taiwan, and you're living a good life in Taiwan, perhaps you'll realize, oh, that's disinformation. Actually, my life in Taiwan is pretty good. This source is perhaps untrustworthy. So yeah, I think these topics of trust and resilience and the relationship between the government and their people, really, really important to Taiwan's security in general. And I figured, or we figured, right, for this episode, what better guest to bring in than Audrey Tang. She is the former digital minister of Taiwan and currently serves as the ambassador at large for cyber affairs. So yeah, let's get into our conversation with her.
All right, sounds good.
Audrey Tang, Minister Tang, Ambassador Tang, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really grateful to have you in our podcast studio and discussing this really important topic of digital resilience. First, to give our listeners a little bit more background on your positions in government and perhaps the private sector, which will, or civil society, which we'll touch upon in a little bit, can you share with us a little bit about your time as digital minister? You were the first digital minister. You essentially set up the entire ministry, and it was during the COVID-19 pandemic, which was, I can imagine, even more difficult, right, to set up an entire office. So can you share a little bit about your successes, what you're most proud of, how you took on that leadership role, and also how you prioritized digital resilience?
Certainly. I'm really happy to be here. In 2014, that was the time that I first got into public service. That year in March, we have the Sunflower Movement, where people took to the streets to protest a sudden passing of a trade deal with Beijing that would have exposed our then new 4G infrastructure to Huawei and ZTE and so on. People were very worried. And instead of just protesting, a bunch of protesters went into the parliament during the night and just stayed there for 3 weeks. And we call ourselves not protesters, then just also demonstrators, to show that actually it is possible to involve 500,000 people on the street and many more online on a face-to-face and also live-streamed deliberation that sets the keynote, the tone of what people actually want out of a trade deal. And it is one of those very rare Occupy movements that every day we just read to the plenary, to everybody, what was agreed on the previous day. There were like 20 NGOs, each in one occupied corner of the street, during conversations around cybersecurity, around labor, around environment rights, and so on. And so at the end of that year, 2014, the trust level started to grow when the cabinet tapped into the civic activists, the civic technologists community, hiring us essentially as young advisors or reverse mentors. The trust level was really low at the beginning of that year, like 9%. So we are a polity with 23 million people. That means that anything the President Ma Ying-jeou says, like 20 million people are automatically against it at the time. And so I think by resilience, we first and foremost mean societal resilience, the ability for people to trust each other again. After so much polarization, so much demonstration, we want to demo a space where people can actually trust each other, to see not as polarized extreme version of themselves, but rather come to common understanding and amplify that common understanding. So by 2020, which was during the first year of the pandemic, we did not lock down any cities. We never did for the 3 years. And we managed to tame, essentially, the infodemic, the disinformation crisis that was impacting everybody around the world at the time, and rebuilt the trust level. So I think the approval rate was above 70%. That year.
Wow.
And so we did that through a series of radical transparency, co-creation, and so on. So that has been my main work as digital minister.
Can you explain a little bit more on radical transparency? It's something that you've championed all around the world, and I hear you talk about it a lot. So for our listeners, can you explain, right, radical transparency, especially for government, right? That's either really good from a private citizen perspective, but from the government's perspective, that's not always something you might hear, right?
Now, first of all, I would say that there are also authoritarian regimes that uses this word transparency, but they make their citizens transparent to the state.
Yes, not the type we're talking about here.
No, not the type we're talking. We're making the state transparent to the citizens. So practically, that means we make sure that whenever there is like dispute, controversy about what things actually are going. So around the time I went into the cabinet, there was a lot of doubt around like whether the PM 2.5 air pollution, did it came from abroad? Did it came from the motorcycles? Did it came from the power plants? And it was a big issue back then. Instead of just the government publishing the numbers, the great thing about the Taiwanese young democracy is that there's a lot of people who want to contribute. And so people made those air boxes, very small devices that they put on their balcony, on their schools, and so on, that just measures air quality. And so radical transparency means that we work with distributed ledgers like blockchain technologies that allows the civil society, the government, the private sector that want to contribute, the educators. We make sure that each and every school has at least one of those air boxes, can all write into this distributed ledger, and nobody can tamper those records. And so very quickly, it became a complete picture of where exactly the pollution is coming from, that not only made it much easier to get to the roots of the pollution and also find them, but also ensuring that it's a continuous common experience, which was the one thing that can heal polarization. It is both sides having something uncommon, in common, which is, we all understand now that these measurements are to be trusted, it's continuous, it's contributed, and then we all refer to it, basically. And so it shifts the demand side. Like we demand the government to fix the pollution issue, into the supply side. We can also contribute to better data quality and so on. And so the entire transcripts of the internal meetings, of the lobbyist visits, the journalist visits around these issues, I published on the Say It website, which if you check it out at sayit.archive.tw, you can see thousands and thousands of people having conversations with me, and also the entire how and why of policy making, not just the policies made. And this empowered investigative journalism. It also empowered language models down the road so that everybody can actually go to any pre-trained model and see a very good imitation of Audrey Tang and policy.
You're ahead of the curve.
Exactly. Very brave of you.
It's in the commons, it's CC0, so it's included in every air training set.
Wow. And actually, that's a really great segue into talking about sort of how you specifically came to be digital minister, because of course that didn't come out of nowhere, right? You have been very involved in the question of digital resilience from the civil society side long before the digital ministry even existed. There are, your initiatives like GovZero, more recently V Taiwan. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about those projects for people who may not have heard of them before, sort of what their goals are and what they've accomplished.
Certainly. So I was an early contributor to the GovZero or G0V movement. It started in 2012 when there was this advertisement done by the administration at the time about a national action plan to power up the economy, but the advertisement just showed people very puzzled by the budgets and says, it's too complicated to understand, just, go with it, which was not very popular with the audience at the time. And there's a bunch of civic technologists, many of them my friends, that look at this advertisement and say, hey, if the budget is not understandable, maybe it's not the citizen's problem. Maybe it is because it's published in PDF with very obscure terminologies and so on. So they made a visualization that is interactive, that makes it very easy to zoom out and see which topics and so on. And most critically, they allowed this real-time commenting on the specific part of budget and also proposal of newer budget items and so on. And so that was a really good initial start, but the brilliance was that they call it budget.g0v.tw. That is to say, any government website which always ends in .gov.tw coming from the government, you can change the O to a 0 and get into this shadow government that is actually always open source. And so there is no reason why, if people like this forked version, meaning that the version that does the same thing, just better and more interactive, it cannot be merged back to the government. Actually, the demand becoming the government should just merge back the civil society reimagination of public service delivery, again, moving from the demand side to the supply side. So I was mainly responsible to this multilingual dictionary that is a little bit like Urban Dictionary, where people can contribute newer words and so on. Because in Taiwan, we have 20 national languages, 16 indigenous nations with 42 language variations among them, and also Taiwanese Taiyi and Hakka and so on. And so having this crowdsourced multilingual dictionary also strengthens the societal resilience because people can see a single historic event with like 20 different ethnic, cultural, religious, and so on, different views, and a shared vocabulary also means that people can then see transculturally, seeing things from the other culture's perspectives, and so on. So it's called the MOE, or Ministry of Education Dictionary Project. That project went so successful that it was basically highlighted by the Ministry of Education as, a showcase for open data, and that paved the way for me to also join the curriculum committee so that we change the idea of media literacy in our curriculum to media competence. Basically, instead of just watching news and reading dictionaries, the students are actually contributing to newer entries in the dictionary, fact-checking the presidential candidate as they're having a debate, contribute to air pollution monitoring, and so on. So that's Gov0. And V-Taiwan takes this spirit into policymaking. So V-Taiwan was set up in 2014. So right after the Sunflower Movement, we asked ourselves, did it really take occupying physically the parliament, however peacefully, to have a society-wide deliberation on a emerging policy? What if, when discussing issues like Uber and so on, where the stakeholders are mainly connected, can we replicate this open space technology, this facilitated conversation, this getting consensus and reading out to the plenary? Can we do that in the cyberspace? And so V-Taiwan was an early experiment in saying, okay, maybe we invite Uber drivers, taxi drivers, and so on, and make the polarized views really apparent on a visual display so that you can see exactly which of the four groups, the taxi driver, Uber drivers, Uber passengers, other people who care about rural rights, and so on. You can just go to the V-Taiwan website, see fellow citizen sentiment, vote up or down, but there's no reply, so no room for trolls to grow, and see your avatar into one of the groups that you belong that shares the views with you. And then over 3 weeks, we just keep highlighting the bridging views, the views that bring those different groups together, that people can actually all support. For example, not undercutting existing meters, but surge pricing is fine. Oh, everybody is for that. And so after 3 weeks, we have this set of like 9 consensus points, which we then take for the multi-stakeholder consultation and then became law. So that is how we very quickly, instead of kind of flip-flopping as many other jurisdictions do, extractive economy, sharing economy, we just settle on very practical consensus. And Uber is now, of course, a legal taxi fleet in Taiwan, but the rural co-ops and so on all get preferential treatment so that they can also become ride-sharing apps.
Yeah, I love that image of kind of a digital parliament or a digital town square where people can come together and maybe not have to think of an issue as yes, no, black or white, but sort of offer their various different views and find those smaller places where they can really come into agreement. I love that.
Yeah, in my mind, it takes the politics, the partisan politics out of all of this, because it doesn't matter what your maybe national politics are, right? You might have a view on how Uber wants to enter your society. So I think, thank you for sharing that for our audience, because I think, especially for whether our Americans audiences listening, it's hard to imagine sometimes an issue being purely about the issue. But really, when you look at it from a digital perspective, as you've explained, it's really just that issue, right? You don't need to have all that noise. So I really, appreciate you sharing that. I wanted to turn now, talking about these concepts of whether it's open source, coding or open source platforms, and also opening up platforms for people to contribute. In your documentary, you explained about your recent documentary, A Good Enough Ancestor. You explained to everyone how technology developed alongside Taiwan's democracy. And I thought that was such an obvious point, but I had never heard it explained like that, right? Because when I think back on it, yes, that's exactly right. I mean, Taiwan's democracy is so young, technology is still relatively new. And so the fact that both were able to develop together, I think that was such a great point for you to highlight. Because of that, you, of course, have championed also the term digital democracy. And we really think that that plays a big role in digital resilience. So we're wondering if you can explain what digital democracy is in your eyes.
Definitely. So the V-Taiwan model was adopted around the world after 2015. You can look up, for example, in Bowling Green, Kentucky, they had this the entirety of town meeting that just prioritize where to go as a policy. And they're repeating this as we speak. So it's becoming an institutionalized thing. Of course, in Finland, in Japan, in many other places, people are trying this out. I think what it does fundamentally is to expand our imagination so that democracy is not just voting for a person or a few people. I think what it does is to increase the bandwidth of democracy. If you vote just for one person every 4 years out of like 8 candidates, that's just 3 bits every 4 years. It's very limited bandwidth. But if you can vote for the participatory budgeting, the priority of budgets, if you can do face-to-face conversation like a citizens' assemblies or jury and so on policies, if you do that also with digital live streaming and transcripts and so on, it reaches far more people and allows for far higher quality interactions than just a vote would do. So digital in Taiwan, we translate it as 数位, and it also means plural, like more than one, many, right? So I'm also the minister for plurality. and what that means is that we can, using digital means, see the full diversity, but not reducing it to like partisan binary spectrum. And then we use digital tools like AI tools to show people, despite the differences, actually, these few things we do have in common. So if you have used community notes on x.com, that's exactly the same algorithm we used. They took that and made an open source version of that so that you can, fact check Elon Musk or something. But your fact check only gets published along with Elon's post if people on the left wing and the right wing both agree with the context that provided by your note, right? So it takes both wings to fly like a bird, right? So that is the main idea. It is to take plurality, that is to say diversity, and build bridges across those diversity.
Yeah, and I think that, now the idea of digital democracy feels, a little bit more established. But I imagine at the time that you may have actually gotten some pushback on that, whether from people who think that, the average everyday person doesn't know enough about politics to be involved, or from everyday people who maybe just don't trust the government enough to want to participate. And so I'm curious if that is true, if there was that pushback, and kind of how you addressed that.
Well, I'm very fortunate to introduce these methods during a time where the government was enjoying 9% of legitimacy and approval, which means that anything that gets more trust from people than 9% are automatically a good idea.
Well, I mean, your ideas are good no matter what, I think objectively, so.
Well, but these were early prototypes. So granted, these are like civil society run. So I was part of civil society. I was just a young reverse mentor. I was 33 at the time. And so there's no kind of top-down blessing, air cover from the president or anything like that. We're really just saying, people are really angry. There's a lot of energy countering whatever the government is doing. what if we can make a space, a safe space, for people to express such outrage and upsetness and so on, and then simply asking the people, okay, so now what should we do together? So I think that was the main thing. It is not to replace representatives. It is not to replace referendums. It is not to replace the executive branch. What it does is like a better form of polling. Instead of polling to show that people are divided, this is polling asking people, how do you feel? And the great things about feelings is that it's much more nuanced. And when people see feelings that they can resonate with, then despite the different political leanings and so on, there's now a shared feeling of, oh, actually, this sounds good, right? And then that experience makes it much easier for other people then to coalesce around those shared feelings instead of on the one or two polarized talking points that people just, stuck there forever, right? So it is about discovering the uncommon ground. So building this as a discovery process, I think, was the main way that we were able to then ally with the career public service, with people who are, well, credibly neutral. They're in the system. They also want to get their message out, but they understand now to give no trust is to get no trust. So maybe they should listen first and trust the people in coming up with ideas and then respond to those common ideas.
Yeah, and I think that is a great expression of radical transparency, right? Because now you have no choice but to see what other people feel, how other people feel. And in many ways, I think that can make a society much stronger, right? Because we all in that society are able to understand, oh, this person actually agrees with me, even if we might have completely different views about something else. So no, that's a wonderful way of building up democracy. And very creative, I would say, technologically. So speaking of technology, of course, at SCSP, we have spent a lot of time thinking about how AI is impacting, whether it's our economy, our society, our national security, of course, democracy, right? How do you see AI impacting all of the work you've done so far?
So the vTaiwan tool relies on AI. There's no way that a person can sort through thousands and thousands of sentiments and people's reaction to those sentiments and just manually cluster people, manually finding the one or two bridging statements. It is not possible. So it was open source tools that uses k-means clustering, principal component analysis, these AI techniques to make sure that people can have this kind of group selfie that shows the kind of group picture right around. So it takes AI, what I call assistive intelligence, to let people see more clearly this group selfie, this group picture of where we exactly are. And that's good because then the distance is bounded. Like, okay, so we disagree on these like three things. And this is good because otherwise people project like extremism to the other group. Like, oh, we disagree on everything. No, it's just those three things. And the other 97 things, we actually all agree with our neighbors. It was just not given, time on TV or on the more antisocial corners of social media.
Antisocial corners of social media.
Yeah, so that takes AI. So I often like this idea of assistive intelligence to my eyeglasses, which is a assistive technology. It is not to replace my eyes. It is to augment my eyes. It is not to prevent me from talking to other people. It actually makes talking to other people much easier and seeing the group picture much easier. So that's how we deploy AI as assistive intelligences to collective intelligence. So we can also call it ACI, augmented collective intelligence.
Wow. I love your perspective on these things because it feels like we're looking at the same picture, and yet you have such an interesting way of reframing it. So I'm thinking about it completely differently, and it's very energizing. I feel excited about the things you're talking about. But I wonder actually if maybe we could turn to sort of the flip side of the coin of what people think, one way that AI could impact our democracy, maybe in not as positive a way, right? There's a lot of concern about how it might be used to help influence populations in negative ways, right? And specifically in Taiwan's case, of course, the largest concern is the kind of influence that comes from China. And obviously, a major part of digital resilience is sort of your cognitive resilience to what you're seeing online. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your work on that piece and sort of where that kind of influence fits into China's larger strategy towards Taiwan.
Certainly. So I think the main narrative coming from authoritarian regimes is a meta-narrative that says democracy only leads to polarization and chaos. Democracy never delivers. And then every year, depending on which crisis was happening, the message is tailored. For example, only top-down ways can counter the pandemic because lockdown is the only way possible. If you don't do that, you're sacrificing public health. Or we have to take down the journalists' very reasonable questions about the efficacy of masks and so on, because if we don't, then it polarizes the society and you can't have a robust response to the virus and so on, right? Mm-hmm. So these are the meta narratives. So to counter these narratives, we need to find a way to not take anything down, to not lock anything down. And according to Freedom House, Taiwan is the most free society and also the most free on the internet in all of Asia. And so the point is, in a free society, people are going to disagree, sometimes very violently. Mm-hmm. And so the media competence that we refer to is very important so that people, even when they're just in middle school and so on, can contribute to what we call pre-bunking, which is not debunking. Debunking is when a narrative, when a polarization attempt, when a disinformation campaign has already reached everybody in the society. And then we start saying, oh, it's not like that. It doesn't work. Mm-hmm. Pre-bunking means even before these polarization attacks take hold, we ensure within just a couple hours, we have a message that we know are resonating with the population that was contributed by people to, for example, COFAX, the collaborative fact-checking mechanism, and then we just amplify it to everybody. One early example. In early 2020, there's one side of people who said, according to our SARS experience, only N95, very high-quality masks are useful, and anything else is harmful. Mm-hmm. On the other side, people are saying, oh, it's about ventilation, aerosol, and so on. So wearing any mask is harmful. And so the polarization attack is not about supporting this or that. It's about amplifying both extremes. Mm-hmm. So the society start fighting. But even before that took hold, we instilled this mechanism in each and every ministry called participation officers. And these are people who are about listening broadly. So they're not broadcasters, they're broad listeners. And then we work with the young people, with high school students and their civics teachers to figure out very quickly what was the one uncommon common ground that both sides of this mask debate can understand. And so as a result of that, the very next day, we pushed out a meme, a very cute Shiba Inu, like the Dodge dog, and putting her paw to her mouth. And she was a companion dog living with the Ministry of Health participation officer. And then the dog says very simply, wear a mask to remind yourself to wash your hand before touching your face. So it's a reminder that don't touch your face with your dirty hands, nothing else, right? So we're not forcing you to wear a mask. Actually, we wear a mask to remind you to wash your hands. And this is such a common ground that nobody can really say, oh, it's not the case. It's obviously the case, right? And so that pre-bunked the entire mask debate. And so a structured way to listen broadly, a structured way to have conversation deliberation, and a structured way to very quickly converge around something that is a common point, again, saves the day, because otherwise people are going to spend much more time fighting each other than fighting the virus.
Yeah, that's so interesting to kind of hear the backstory from that, because I was living in Taiwan at that time, and I was very closely following the Shiba Inu's advice on social media. Yes,
I Libby saw the memes.
And I never would have thought of how much sort of, deep thought went into how that message was crafted and how impactful it was. But I, for one, was following along.
And it worked.
And I was remembering to wear my mask.
Did you wash your hands more?
Yes, I was very conscious of that too. And my skin was never better.
It's like on the airplane where I wipe down the seat and I used to get some really weird looks. And now people think, oh, that's actually really smart. Why didn't I think of that? I'm like, well, there are germs. Anyways, Audrey, I we've had a wonderful conversation so far of what you've done in the past, whether it's at the beginning of your involvement with civil society and government all the way up till now. you have a new role. You're ambassador for cyber affairs, or ambassador at large for cyber affairs. Congratulations again. Of course, well deserved. And we're really excited to see you travel the world to spread this incredible message. We're wondering if you can share perhaps your priorities looking forward. You were just recently appointed, so I'd imagine there's a lot of strategy and just thinking about the next few years. If you can share, what are your priorities as cyber ambassador?
So concretely, it means aligning the AI trajectory from like artificial superintelligence to augmented collective intelligence. That's like number one priority for me. And that was the case because when I was the Minister of Digital Affairs, I set up the AIEC, the AI Evaluation Center. That was before this AI Safety Institute movement. And we want to make sure that people have a way to align AI and to have very specific social expectations of AI's role in the society. And for the research community to then devise ways to explain that AI's inner workings so that people can see that, this particular role fulfilled by AI is actually doing as we intended. It's like co-domestication of a alien and then assistive intelligence. So when I was Minister of Digital Affairs, for example, we held a conversation about deepfakes on the social media. And we sent 200,000 SMS text messages to random numbers around Taiwan, asking, how do you feel about those crypto scams and things like that impersonate celebrities, right? And then a lot of people sign up for an online civic assembly. And then 450 people chosen by random sortation met online in 45 rooms of 10 people each. But they were facilitated by an AI facilitator. There's no human facilitation. A real-time transcript shows points of divergence, points of convergence, when you can move on. And then a real-time sense-making AI took the good ideas from the 45 rooms and weaved them together into very coherent policy. So for example, if a social media company posts a crypto scam featuring a celebrity from Elon maybe, they should then get a digital signature from Elon. If they don't, and somebody gets scammed for 1 million in Taiwan, today, January 1st, 2025, the platform is liable for that 1 million damage. And if they don't comply, instead of just fining them, we can actually dial back on their internet connection speed. So it becomes slower to connect to the social media. And of course, there's also social sanction. People simply won't put advertisements on the social media. So instead of the state getting into the business of censorship and things like that, which we never do in Taiwan, we basically ask the people, what is the acceptable kind of guide rail, not just guardrail, for this advanced generative AI to enter our lives, and what liability and responsibility should the other big players like social media play. And so I think this is a really powerful instinct that AI facilitates better conversations in a democracy that can be then used to tame and align AI. So this is a virtuous cycle. So making sure that this Taiwan model is understood by the global AI Safety Institute's community and in the AI Action Summit and so on, that's my number one priority.
Wow, I would love to be a fly on the wall for one of those discussions. I would love to see how AI sort of, facilitates and moderates people's sharing of their opinions. That's so interesting.
Yeah, no. Well, best of luck with that. I think we have one more fun question for you, Libby.
Yes. So our goal with this is, of course, we want our listeners, whether they live in Taiwan, have been to Taiwan, or don't really know much about Taiwan at all, to get to know it a little better. So one thing we'd love to ask all of our guests is if you could recommend one thing from Taiwan, whether it's a food, a place, a book, a show you've watched, something that you think could help people get to know Taiwan a bit better, what would you recommend?
That's a great question. My sincere suggestion is simply to get to know the Taiwan Gold Card program. It is a program that if you contribute to open source or Wikipedia or YouTube, if you're a YouTuber, or a blogger, or really anything, you contribute to Internet Commons for 8 years, then we give you residency of Taiwan with healthcare. Like everything. And then the next time you visit Taiwan, you're a resident, you become kind of also Taiwanese. And if you like Taiwan, then after 5 years and your contributions to Taiwan and so on, you get to naturalize without giving up your original passport. And so this is a very interesting view, a very open view when it comes to what we say our polity, what are Taiwanese. It's basically anyone who identifies with this idea of an open democracy, anyone who contributes in the commons, anyone who look at what the current divisions are, the polarizations are, and so on, and then just contribute their bridge into the internet, basically. Anyone who does that is eligible for the gold card. There are many other ways to get a gold card, so check out Taiwan Gold Card.
Okay, well, Channing, we better get to work on our YouTube channel.
Yeah, let's start a YouTube channel so we can also get gold cards in Taiwan. Audrey, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Our listeners and Libby and I are very privileged to hear from you. So thank you so much again.
Thank you so much. Live long and prosper.
What was your main takeaway from our conversation, right? We talked about digital resilience at the beginning. Audrey gave us a glimpse of how Taiwan was able to basically go from nothing to everything they have now. What was your biggest takeaway?
Yeah, I think for me, kind of a 2-for-1 takeaway maybe is the willingness to experiment and the real good that can come out of that, right? They were working off of, just sort of trying out ideas and seeing how they worked, right? And I think that allowance for creativity and a little risk-taking to actually say, people know what they want, right? People want to take part in this. People have opinions that have value and they can lead to good policy outcomes. I thought that was a great lesson that other countries, kind of regardless of big or small, could really learn from.
Yeah, sometimes I think when we think about democracy, we almost think too much about government, right? And so Audrey's flipping that on its head, talking about how can the people participate more.
Yeah, what about you?
Yeah, for me, every time I hear Audrey speak or have a conversation, I am just feeling so inspired by her optimism. I think she was exactly right when she said sometimes people or adversaries are trying to spread the narrative that democracy is broken or that democracy is not working. But clearly it is working in Taiwan, definitely not without challenge, but they're making it work. And so for Audrey to be able to articulate exactly how they were able to bring civil society together, bring in those technological capabilities, bring in innovation power, right, to really push their democracy to the next level and also innovate globally on these ideas about digital democracy, about radical transparency. I mean, that just fills me with optimism. And I hope that's a message that we can all take away because whether lessons learned from Taiwan, whether it's lessons learned from other democracies around the world, anytime we're thinking about digital resilience, there are always good, positive stories there to share. So I'm glad we were able to highlight that.
Yeah, what a great note to end it on. I feel like in the policy world, you don't always get to have these optimistic conversations. So I'm glad we get to leave people with something to feel inspired about.
Well, that concludes today's episode. Thank you again to our very special guest, Audrey Tang. Thank you, Libby, for having this conversation with me. And we look forward.
Straightforward.
We look straight forward to see you next time.